The rain had turned violent by the time Eleanor reached the garden, fat drops pelting her black dress until the silk clung to her skin like a second funeral shroud. She didn't care. The perfectly manicured hedges her father had loved provided just enough cover from the townhouse windows, and that was all that mattered. Through the glass, she could still see them, Richard and Victoria, heads bent together over documents spread across the dining table like cards in a rigged game. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Eleanor's hands shook as she fumbled with the brass clasps on her father's briefcase. The leather was soft from decades of use, worn smooth by Henry Hart's capable hands during countless business meetings, contract signings, property acquisitions. Now those same hands were cold in the ground, buried just hours ago while rain drummed on the cemetery awning and Eleanor had stood alone because her husband had been too busy for her grief. The first clasp released with a soft click that seemed obscenely loud in the garden stillness. Eleanor glanced up at the windows, but Richard and Victoria remained absorbed in their plotting, oblivious to the daughter and wife they'd so thoroughly underestimated. The second clasp opened, and Eleanor lifted the lid with trembling fingers. A cream-colored envelope lay on top, her name written in her father's distinctive handwriting. Beneath it, she could see the edges of legal documents, photographs, what looked like bank statements. But it was the envelope that drew her attention, the familiar script that made her throat close with fresh grief. She'd seen that handwriting on birthday cards, on notes tucked into her lunchbox as a child, on the letter he'd written her when she'd gotten married 3 years ago. That letter had warned her too, she realized now. She'd just been too in love, too willful, too certain of her own judgment to listen. Eleanor tore open the envelope, not caring that the rain was already beginning to blur the ink at the edges. Her father's voice seemed to echo from the page as she read. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you in person, but I made sure you're protected nevertheless. By now, you've probably heard or seen something that made you doubt your marriage.
Trust that instinct.
Richard Hale married you for money, not love. I know this is painful to read, especially now, but you need to know the truth. Your husband is a predator who has done this before, and he will destroy you financially if you let him." Eleanor's vision blurred, though whether from tears or rain, she couldn't tell. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each sentence a small detonation in her chest. She forced herself to keep reading. "Everything you need to stop him is in this briefcase. I've spent the last 8 months having him investigated, and what we found is worse than I feared. But before you look at the evidence, you need to know this. The inheritance I left you is completely protected. Richard cannot touch a single dollar. It's all in an irrevocable trust that only you can access. The lawyers will explain the details, but the important thing is this. You are safe. You are financially secure. And you have choices." The letter continued with instructions to contact Marcus Wellington, her father's estate attorney, and a plea. Don't confront Richard yet. Don't let him know you've discovered anything. Men like him are dangerous when cornered, and he has significant debts that make him desperate. Outmaneuver him, Eleanor. You're smarter than he ever gave you credit for. I love you. Stay strong. Dad. Eleanor pressed the letter to her chest, heedless of the rain soaking through the paper, and let herself sob once, hard and silent, before forcing herself back under control. She couldn't afford to break down now. Not when Richard was inside, plotting her destruction. Not when she still had to walk back through that door and pretend she suspected nothing. She set the letter aside carefully and reached for the first document in the briefcase. It was a trust agreement, dense with legal language, but certain phrases leapt out at her. Irrevocable.
Sole beneficiari.
No spousal claim. $22 million in Manhattan commercial real estate, 15 properties scattered across the city's most valuable neighborhoods. Properties her father had accumulated over 40 years of shrewd investing, and all of it now hers, protected behind legal walls that Richard's manipulation couldn't breach. Beneath the trust documents was a forensic accounting report. Eleanor's stomach turned as she scanned the executive summary. Richard had been systematically draining their marital accounts for the past year, siphoning money in small amounts that wouldn't trigger her attention. $340,000 gone. The report detailed wire transfers to offshore accounts, cash withdrawals at casinos in Atlantic City, payments to luxury hotels where Richard had apparently spent weekends Eleanor had believed were business trips. But it was the next document that made Eleanor's hands still completely. A private investigator's report, thick with photographs and bank records and witness statements. The first page showed a headshot of a beautiful blonde woman, elegant and refined, with sad eyes that looked familiar somehow.
Catherine Brennan, née Harrington.
Married to Richard Hale from 2015 to 2017. The investigator's notes were clinical but devastating. Richard had courted Catherine after her parents died in a car accident, married her within 6 months, gained access to her inheritance, and systematically destroyed her over 18 months. When Catherine finally filed for divorce, she'd lost everything: her family's jewelry business, her trust fund, her childhood home. The final page of the report contained a newspaper clipping. Sozialite Catherine Brennan, 29, dies in apparent suicide. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, but she couldn't stop the gasp that escaped. Catherine Brennan had jumped from her apartment window 2 years ago, 6 months after Richard had left her destitute. And Eleanor, fool as she was, had married the man who'd driven Catherine to that window ledge just 1 year later. She forced herself to keep reading. There was a second wife, Diane Morrison, married to Richard from 2018 to 2020. Another inheritance, another systematic theft, another woman left with nothing. But Diane had survived, though the investigator's notes suggested she was barely scraping by in New Jersey, working 2 jobs to pay off the debts Richard had left in her name. Eleanor's grief was transforming into something colder and harder with each page she turned. Richard wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a serial predator who had perfected the art of financial murder. Catherine's death wasn't just tragedy. It was the inevitable conclusion of Richard's particular brand of cruelty. The next section of the briefcase contained evidence Eleanor recognized, though she'd never understood its significance before. Forged signatures on loan documents. Her own name, perfectly replicated, but slightly wrong in ways she could see now that she was looking. Richard had been practicing her signature, preparing to steal from her the same way he'd stolen from Catherine and Diane. There were more documents, more evidence, but Eleanor couldn't process them all. Not here, not now, not with Richard inside waiting for her to return so he could begin his final performance of the devoted husband helping his grief-stricken wife navigate complicated financial matters. She looked up at the townhouse, at the warm lights glowing in the windows, at her husband's silhouette as he gestured to Victoria Chin, probably explaining how easy it would be to manipulate poor, naive Eleanor into signing over her father's empire. Richard had no idea that Henry Hart had spent his final months building an arsenal for his daughter. That every forged signature, every stolen dollar, every manipulation had been documented and preserved. Eleanor gathered the documents carefully, protecting them from the rain with her body as she closed the briefcase. Her funeral dress was ruined, her hair plastered to her skull, her makeup running in dark rivulets down her cheeks. She looked, she realized, exactly like a woman destroyed by grief. It was the perfect disguise. As she stood in the garden, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. The woman who had left for her father's funeral that morning had been soft, trusting, willing to believe the best of people. That woman was gone, buried alongside Henry Hart in the rain-soaked cemetery. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, more dangerous. Someone who had learned that kindness without boundaries was just another word for victim. Eleanor walked to the garden door, pausing with her hand on the handle. Through the window, she could see Richard checking his watch, probably wondering where his grieving wife had gone. In a moment, she would open this door. She would walk inside with her ruined dress and her tear-stained face. She would let Richard comfort her, let him guide her to the couch, let him bring her tea laced with whatever performance of care he'd perfected over 3 years of marriage. And she would begin the most important performance of her life. Because Richard Hale thought he had married a fortune. But what he'd actually married was Henry Hart's daughter. And Henry Hart hadn't raised a victim. He'd raised a woman who knew how to wait, how to plan, how to strike when the moment was precisely right. Eleanor opened the door and stepped into the warmth of her home, briefcase clutched tight against her chest. Richard looked up, his face arranging itself into an expression of tender concern that probably looked genuine to anyone who hadn't just read the truth about him. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, moving toward her with open arms. "You're soaked through. Where have you been?" Eleanor let herself collapse into his embrace, let herself shake with what he would interpret as grief. "I just needed air," she whispered against his shoulder. "I couldn't breathe." "I know, baby. I know." Richard's hand rubbed circles on her back, and Eleanor closed her eyes against the revulsion that threatened to break her composure. "But you're home now. I'm here. I'll take care of everything." Yes, Eleanor thought, her fingers tightening on the briefcase handle. "You'll take care of everything, Richard. Just like you took care of Catherine. Just like you took care of Diane." But this time, the story was going to end differently. This time, the fortune hunter had finally met his match. Marcus Wellington's law office occupied the 42nd floor of a building Eleanor's father had owned for 30 years. She'd forgotten that detail until the elevator doors opened and she saw the familiar brass nameplate, Hart Properties. Even in death, Henry Hart was still protecting her, still providing sanctuary in the empire he'd built. Eleanor had told Richard she was meeting with the estate attorney to handle preliminary paperwork. Nothing unusual, nothing that would trigger his suspicion. He'd kissed her forehead that morning and told her not to worry about the complicated legal matters, that he'd be happy to attend the meeting with her if she needed support. The offer had made her skin crawl, but she'd smiled and said she could manage a simple signature session alone. If only he knew what she was really signing. Marcus rose from behind his desk as his assistant showed Eleanor in. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s perhaps, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes swept over her now with an assessment that felt both professional and protective. "Miss Hart," he said, then corrected himself with a sad smile. "I suppose it's Mrs. Hale now. Though perhaps not for much longer, if your father's instincts were correct." He was correct about everything. Eleanor's voice was steadier than she'd expected. "I read the briefcase contents last night." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk, but Eleanor remained standing, too wired to sit. She could see the Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows, 15 buildings that now belonged to her, scattered like chess pieces across the board her father had been playing for decades. "Your father came to me 8 months ago," Marcus said quietly. "He'd noticed some irregularities in your husband's behavior. Business associates who didn't exist. Phone calls Richard would take in another room. The way he'd started asking questions about your father's health, his assets, his estate planning." Marcus pulled a file from his drawer, thick with tabs and notes. "Henry asked me to investigate quietly. What we found was worse than either of us anticipated." Eleanor finally sat, her legs suddenly weak. "Catherine Brennan. You saw the report." Marcus's expression darkened. "That one haunts me, Miss Hart. We found her too late. By the time we understood the full pattern of what Richard does, Catherine was already gone." "And Diane Morrison?" "Still alive, though barely. Your father wanted to help her, but we had to be careful. Any contact might have tipped Richard off that we knew about his previous marriages." Marcus leaned forward. Your father spent his last months building a fortress around you. The trust is ironclad. Richard cannot touch it, cannot contest it, cannot claim any marital interest in it whatsoever. Every property is held in a structure that predates your marriage. Eleanor pulled the forged loan documents from her purse. But he's already been stealing from me. Our joint accounts, our savings. And these signatures he's been practicing. Marcus studied the documents with practiced efficiency. Patricia Chun is waiting in the conference room. She's the forensic accountant who did the initial investigation. Between what she's found and what you've discovered, we have more than enough for criminal charges. Criminal charges. The words felt foreign in Eleanor's mouth. She was talking about having her husband arrested. The man who'd held her during her father's final moments in the hospital, who'd whispered comfort when she'd sobbed in the dark. Except none of that had been real. It had all been performance, every touch calculated, every kindness strategic. There's something else you need to know. Marcus's tone shifted, became heavier. Richard owes money to some very dangerous people. $800,000 to a loan shark operation that Victoria Chen's organization is connected to. We believe that's why he's escalating his timeline. He's not just greedy, Eleanor. He's desperate. The implications settled over her like a shroud. Desperate men were unpredictable, dangerous. He suggested we try for a baby last week. Marcus's jaw tightened. Classic control tactic. Pregnancy would make you more vulnerable, give him leverage in any divorce proceedings, and potentially give him access to trust funds set aside for grandchildren. He paused. Your father anticipated that too. Any trusts for children are structured to bypass spousal access entirely. Eleanor laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. He thought of everything. Not everything. He couldn't save you from the pain of discovering the truth. That part you have to carry alone. Marcus's voice softened. But he made sure you'd have the tools to fight back. The question is, what do you want to do with them? Eleanor stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city her father had conquered block by block, deal by deal, year by year. He'd built this empire from nothing, survived market crashes and recessions and cutthroat competitors. And he'd done it all while raising a daughter alone after her mother died, teaching her to be gracious and kind and strong. She'd spent 3 years trying to be the perfect wife for a man who saw her as nothing but a transaction. She'd made herself smaller, quieter, more accommodating, believing that was what love required. But her father had never asked her to be small. He'd built her an empire and trusted her to defend it. Eleanor turned back to Marcus. I want to stop him. Not just from stealing my inheritance, but from ever doing this to anyone else. Catherine Brennan deserves justice. Diane Morrison deserves restitution. And every woman Richard might target in the future deserves protection. Then we'll need to move carefully. Richard can't know you suspect anything until we're ready to move. Marcus pulled out a legal pad. Starting today, you play the grieving widow. Let him think his plan is working. Meanwhile, we build an airtight case. How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. We need to coordinate with law enforcement, gather additional evidence, and most importantly, we need to catch him in the act of fraud. The forged signatures aren't enough. We need him to actually attempt to use them. Eleanor's stomach turned at the thought of 2 more weeks in that townhouse, 2 more weeks of Richard's hands on her skin, his lies in her ears. But she'd endured 3 years of marriage to a predator. She could survive 2 more weeks as his hunter. Tell me what I need to do, she said. Marcus smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor saw something fierce and protective in his expression. It reminded her of her father. First, we're going to make you untouchable. Then, we're going to make him pay. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered in the afternoon sun, 15 buildings standing like sentinels across the skyline. Her father's legacy. Her inheritance. Her weapon. Richard Hale had made the mistake of his life when he'd married Henry Hart's daughter. And Eleanor was going to make sure he understood exactly what that mistake would cost him. The key turned in the lock with the same soft click it had made every evening for 3 years, but tonight Eleanor heard it differently. Tonight, she was walking into enemy territory armed with knowledge that made every familiar surface feel like a trap. The marble foyer her father had paid for. The chandelier Richard had insisted on upgrading with money he'd stolen from their joint account. Even the air felt contaminated by his lies. "Eleanor? Is that you, sweetheart?" Richard's voice drifted from the study, warm and solicitous. The voice of a concerned husband, not a predator circling his prey. She set down her purse with carefully measured movements, the way a truly exhausted woman would. Marcus had coached her during their meeting. Small gestures of fatigue, occasional moments of confusion, the performance of grief so complete that Richard would never suspect she was anything but broken. "Yes, it's me." Richard appeared in the doorway, his expression arranging itself into tender concern so quickly Eleanor almost missed the calculation beneath it. 3 years ago, she would have seen only the concern. Now she saw the actor behind the mask, and it took everything she had not to recoil when he reached for her. "How is the meeting with the attorney?" His hands settled on her shoulders, thumbs moving in what should have been comforting circles. "I was worried about you going alone. Those legal documents can be overwhelming, especially now." "It was fine." Eleanor let her voice crack slightly on the word, watched Richard's eyes sharpen with interest. "Just paperwork. Signatures. Things I don't really understand. That's what I'm here for, baby." Richard guided her toward the living room, his touch proprietary in a way it had never been before. Or perhaps it always had been, and she'd simply been too trusting to notice. "You don't have to carry all this alone. Your father's estate, the properties, the financial decisions, I can help you navigate it all." There it was. The opening gambit, delivered with such apparent selflessness that Eleanor felt a flicker of rage hot enough to burn through her composure. She forced it down, channeled it into the trembling of her hands as she sank onto the couch. "It's so complicated, Richard. The trust structures, the property holdings." Marcus was trying to explain it, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about Dad. She let tears spill over, real ones that had been waiting just beneath her careful control. Let Richard think they were only for her father. Let him believe she was too devastated to notice his manipulation. Of course you were thinking about him. Richard sat beside her, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that had once made her feel safe. Now it felt like a cage closing. "You've been through so much. Maybe it would help if I came to the next meeting with Marcus? I could take notes, ask the questions you're too upset to think of." Eleanor's fingers clutched at his shirt, the gesture of a woman seeking comfort rather than a woman fighting revulsion. "Would you? I feel so lost. Anything for you. You know that." Richard's hand stroked her hair, and Eleanor closed her eyes against the nausea rising in her throat. "In fact, maybe we should talk about simplifying some of these assets. Your father had his fingers in a lot of complicated investments. We could consolidate, make things easier to manage." Consolidate. The word was a knife wrapped in velvet. He wanted to move her father's carefully structured empire into accounts he could access, properties he could liquidate, assets he could steal. Just like he'd done to Catherine. Just like he'd done to Diane. "I don't know." Eleanor pulled back slightly, made her expression confused and overwhelmed. "Marcus said something about the trust being protected, that it couldn't be changed." Richard's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before the concerned husband mask slipped back into place. "Well, that's probably just standard estate attorney language. There are always ways to restructure trusts when it makes financial sense. I have a lawyer friend who specializes in this kind of thing. Maybe we could get a second opinion." A lawyer friend. Probably Victoria Chun or one of her network's other operatives, ready to forge whatever documents Richard needed to steal Eleanor's inheritance. Marcus had warned her this would come, the casual suggestion that would lead to the formal meeting where Richard would have her sign her fortune away while she was too grief-stricken to read the fine print. Maybe. Eleanor let herself sound uncertain, helpless. The word tasted like poison. I just want to do what's right. What Dad would have wanted. Your father would have wanted you to be taken care of. Richard's voice dropped into that intimate register he used when he wanted something. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Take care of you. Take care of his legacy. Make sure everything he built is protected. Protected. As if Richard had any concept of protection beyond protecting his own interests. As if he hadn't driven Catherine Brennan to jump from a window. As if he hadn't left Diane Morrison working 2 jobs to pay off his debts. Eleanor nodded against his chest, making small sounds of agreement while her mind catalogued every word for Marcus, for the FBI, for the case they were building. Richard thought he was reeling her in, setting the hook deeper. He had no idea she was the one holding the line, letting him think he was winning while she gathered evidence of every manipulation. I'm so tired, she whispered, which wasn't a lie. Performing weakness was exhausting in ways she'd never imagined. Can we just go to bed? Of course, sweetheart. Richard helped her up with exaggerated gentleness, his hands supporting her as though she were made of glass. You've had such a difficult day. Let me take care of you. In their bedroom, Eleanor let Richard undress her with tender efficiency, let him pull her into bed and hold her while she pretended to fall asleep. His breathing eventually evened out, the sleep of a man who believed his plan was proceeding perfectly. But Eleanor lay awake in the darkness, counting the seconds until she could move away from his touch, counting the days until this performance would end. 13 more days, Marcus had said. 13 more days of pretending to be the fragile widow, while she built the fortress that would destroy Richard completely. She thought about Catherine, alone in her apartment, staring at an open window and seeing no other escape. She thought about Diane, working herself to exhaustion to pay for Richard's cruelty. And she thought about her father, spending his final months making sure his daughter would have a different ending. 13 more days of lies. Then Richard Hale would learn what it meant to underestimate Henry Hart's daughter. Eleanor closed her eyes and began the mental count. Day 1 complete. 12 to go. The performance had only just begun. The address Marcus had given her led to a small apartment in Newark, the kind of building where paint peeled from window frames and the hallway smelled of old cooking grease and resignation. Eleanor stood outside apartment 3B for a full minute before she could make herself knock, her hand hovering over the door like a bird uncertain of landing. She'd told Richard she was meeting with her father's accountant. Another lie in the growing collection she carried like stones in her pockets, weighing her down even as they built the foundation of Richard's destruction. The woman who opened the door looked older than 34. Diane Morrison's eyes were hollowed out by exhaustion and something darker, something that Eleanor recognized now as the specific kind of devastation that came from having your reality systematically dismantled by someone you loved. She wore scrubs from the hospital where she worked nights, and her hands shook slightly as she stepped aside to let Eleanor enter. I wasn't sure you'd actually come, Diane said quietly. Her apartment was small but meticulously clean, the kind of clean that spoke of rigid control in a life where everything else had spiraled beyond reach. When Marcus called and said Henry Hart's daughter wanted to meet, I thought. She stopped, shook her head. I don't know what I thought. Eleanor sat on the threadbare couch Diane gestured to, choosing her words carefully. I'm married to Richard. I know. Diane's laugh was bitter and broken. Marcus told me. I wanted to warn you, but he said you already knew. That you'd figured it out. My father figured it out. He left me evidence. Eleanor pulled out the private investigator's file, watching Diane's face crumble as she recognized her own story documented in clinical detail. I'm so sorry. For what he did to you. For not knowing sooner. Diane sat heavily in the chair across from her, the file open in her lap but her eyes distant, seeing something Eleanor couldn't. It started exactly the way it probably started with you. He was charming, attentive. He made me feel like the most important person in the world. My parents had just died, car accident, and I was drowning in grief and inheritance and decisions I didn't know how to make. Her voice grew quieter. Richard appeared like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was praying. Eleanor felt the words like a mirror held up to her own marriage, the courtship that had seemed so romantic when her father was dying. Richard's convenient appearance just when she needed someone strong to lean on. He convinced me to make him a partner in my family's business within 6 months of marrying. Said it was about building our future together, about trust. Diane's hands twisted in her lap. Within a year, he'd systematically destroyed everything my parents had built. Forged my signature on loan documents, diverted funds to offshore accounts, made it look like I was the one mismanaging the company. And when you discovered what he'd done? He was already gone. Filed for divorce. Took half of everything that was left, which wasn't much after his theft. Left me with debt collectors and a business in ruins. Diane looked up, and Eleanor saw tears tracking down her cheeks. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing that every moment we'd shared had been a lie. Every "I love you," every intimate conversation, every future we'd planned, all of it was just him playing a role while he robbed me blind. Eleanor's throat tightened. She knew exactly what Diane meant. The nauseating realization that the man she'd built her life around had never existed at all. "There was someone before me," Diane said softly. "Catherine. Did Marcus tell you about her?" "I saw the file. The news clipping." Eleanor could barely force the words out. She jumped. "I didn't know about her until after Richard left me. A reporter doing a story on investment fraud contacted me, asked if I knew Catherine Brennan. That's when I learned Richard's pattern went back further than just me." Diane stood, walked to the window that looked out over the Newark street. "I tried to find her family, to tell them I understood what Catherine went through. Her sister Margaret said Catherine had been vibrant and successful before Richard. After he was done with her, she couldn't see any way forward. The financial destruction, the betrayal, it broke something fundamental in her." Eleanor felt ice spreading through her chest. This could have been her. If her father hadn't suspected, hadn't investigated, hadn't protected her with his dying breath, she could have been Catherine. She could have been Diane. "Why didn't you report him?" Eleanor asked. "Go to the police, press charges?" "I tried. But Richard was careful. Everything he did had just enough plausible deniability. The signatures he forged were close enough that experts couldn't definitively prove fraud. The money he stole was moved through enough accounts that tracing it became impossible. And his lawyers," Diane's voice broke. "His lawyers made me look like an incompetent businesswoman who was blaming her husband for her own failures. By the time the divorce was final, I didn't have the money or the energy to keep fighting." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope Marcus had prepared. Inside was a check for $50,000, the first installment of the restitution Eleanor had already decided Diane deserved. "This is for my father's estate. He wanted to help you, but he couldn't risk alerting Richard while he was still alive." Diane stared at the check like it might disappear. "I can't accept this." "You can. You will." Eleanor's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "And there will be more. Because I'm not just divorcing Richard. I'm destroying him. Every crime he committed, every woman he hurt, every dollar he stole, it's all going to be documented, prosecuted, and punished. He's going to prison, Diane. And when he gets there, he's going to understand that he finally chose the wrong victim." For the first time since Eleanor had arrived, something like hope flickered in Diane's eyes. "You really think you can stop him?" "I know I can. Because unlike Catherine, unlike you, I have something Richard never anticipated." Eleanor stood, gathering her things. "I have my father's fortune, his strategic mind still protecting me, and the evidence to prove every crime Richard's ever committed. But more than that, I have rage. And I'm going to use every dollar, every resource, Every advantage, I have to make sure Richard Hale never destroys another woman. Eleanor left Diane's apartment with the weight of two ghosts on her shoulders. Catherine, who hadn't survived Richard's cruelty. Diane, who had barely survived it. As she drove back to Manhattan, back to the townhouse where she'd sleep beside her husband and pretend she suspected nothing, Eleanor made a silent promise to both women. This wasn't just about protecting her inheritance anymore. This was about justice for every woman Richard had broken. And justice, Eleanor was learning, required a cold heart and an unflinching hand. She had 10 days left to practice both. The FBI field office in Lower Manhattan was nothing like the sleek law offices Eleanor had become accustomed to. The conference room where Agent Gloria Martinez waited was institutional and cold, fluorescent lights humming overhead like anxious insects. Eleanor sat across from the agent, Marcus beside her, and tried not to think about the fact that she was about to become an informant against her own husband. Mrs. Hale, thank you for coming in. Agent Martinez was younger than Eleanor expected, mid-30s with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She slid a photograph across the table. Victoria Chun, smiling at a charity gala, champagne glass raised. How well do you know this woman? She works with my husband. Real estate development, I think. Eleanor kept her voice neutral, though her pulse quickened. I've seen her at company events. Victoria Chun runs one of the most sophisticated fraud networks we've been tracking for the past 18 months. Agent Martinez pulled out more photographs, spreading them across the table like a deck of cards revealing a losing hand. She targets recently widowed women with substantial inheritances. Sometimes she uses romance operatives, men who court these women, marry them, gain access to their assets. Sometimes she poses as a financial advisor or estate attorney. Either way, the result is the same. The inheritance disappears into shell companies and offshore accounts. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. How many women? That we know of? 7 in the past 5 years. But we suspect there are more we haven't identified yet. Agent Martinez tapped another photograph. This one showed Richard and Victoria at what looked like a business lunch, their heads bent close together. Your husband is one of her most effective operators. We've been building a case against both of them, but we need evidence of an active fraud to make arrests that will stick. Marcus leaned forward. You want Eleanor to let Richard proceed with his scheme. We want Mrs. Hale's cooperation in documenting her husband's fraudulent activities. With her consent, we can place surveillance in her home, record conversations, gather evidence of conspiracy, and wire fraud. Agent Martinez's expression softened slightly. I know what we're asking. It's not easy to turn your life into a crime scene. Eleanor thought about Catherine Brennan's sister, grieving a death that could have been prevented. About Diane Morrison, working 2 jobs to survive Richard's theft. About 7 other women she'd never met, women whose lives had been destroyed by the network sitting across from her in glossy photographs. What exactly would I need to do? Agent Martinez pulled out a slim recording device, no larger than a pen. We need you to continue acting normal. Let Richard think his manipulation is working. When he makes his move, asks you to sign documents, meet with his lawyer contact, consolidate your father's assets, we need it all documented. Audio, video if possible, signed documents showing clear intent to defraud. And Victoria? We're running parallel operations. We have undercover agents posing as potential targets, gathering evidence on her network. But Richard is our way into the financial structure. He's been sloppy with you in ways he wasn't with previous victims. Probably because he thinks you're too grief-stricken to notice. Agent Martinez's smile was sharp. That's going to be his downfall. Eleanor accepted the recording device, its weight somehow both insignificant and enormous in her palm. When Richard suggests I meet with his lawyer friend, that's when you want me to record? That and any private conversations where he discusses the plan with Victoria. We need evidence of conspiracy, of both of them working together to defraud you specifically. Agent Martinez pulled out another file, this one thicker than the others. There's something else you should know. Richard owes $800,000 to a loan shark operation that's connected to Victoria's network. We believe that's why he's accelerating his timeline. He's not just stealing from you, he's trying to stay alive. The words settled into Eleanor's chest like stones. Richard wasn't just a predator. He was a desperate predator, which made him more dangerous. Men facing that kind of debt did unpredictable things when cornered. Is my safety at risk? Eleanor asked quietly. Agent Martinez and Marcus exchanged a look that told Eleanor everything she needed to know before the agent spoke. We don't have evidence that Richard has ever been physically violent with previous victims. But we also can't guarantee your safety if he discovers what you're doing. That's why it's crucial that you maintain the performance. No slip-ups, no confrontations, nothing that would alert him to your knowledge. Eleanor looked down at the recording device in her hand. 7 women destroyed.
Catherine dead.
Diane barely surviving. And how many more would there be if Eleanor chose the easy path, the quiet divorce that would save only herself? My father spent his last months protecting me, Eleanor said slowly. He could have just set up the trust and left it at that. But he didn't. He gathered evidence, built a case, made sure I'd have the tools to fight back. She looked up at Agent Martinez. He did that because he believed I was strong enough to use them. I'm not going to prove him wrong. This won't be easy, the agent warned. You'll be living with a man you know is planning to destroy you, acting like you suspect nothing, gathering evidence that could send him to prison for 20 years. The psychological toll is nothing compared to what Catherine Brennan went through alone. Eleanor's voice was steel. I'm not alone. I have my father's resources, Marcus's legal expertise, and now the FBI. Richard and Victoria thought they were hunting another vulnerable widow. They have no idea they've walked into a trap. Agent Martinez smiled, and it was the smile of a hunter recognizing a fellow predator. Then let's make sure it's a trap they can't escape. We'll need to move carefully. Richard will suggest meeting with his lawyer within the next week. When he does, we'll be listening to every word. Eleanor stood, slipping the recording device into her purse beside her father's letter, the one she'd been carrying since the day she opened the briefcase.
2 talismans now.
One from the man who'd loved her enough to protect her from beyond the grave. One from the government agency that would help her turn that protection into prosecution. As she left the FBI building with Marcus, Eleanor checked her phone. 3 missed calls from Richard, each one probably laced with concern and questions about where she'd been. She'd tell him she'd been at the hospital, visiting the wing her father had endowed. Another small lie in the collection that was becoming her armor. 7 days until Richard's lawyer meeting, Agent Martinez had estimated. 7 days of wearing a wire and playing the grieving widow while the FBI documented every word of her husband's conspiracy. Eleanor got into her car and looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her father's daughter looked back, and for the first time since his death, Eleanor saw not grief, but purpose reflected in her own eyes. Richard and Victoria had built their entire operation on the assumption that wealthy widows were vulnerable, naive, easy to manipulate. They were about to learn exactly how wrong an assumption could be. Richard's voice on the phone was carefully modulated concern, the kind that sounded genuine unless you knew to listen for the calculation underneath. Eleanor sat in her father's study, the recording device active in her purse, and let him speak while she cataloged every word for the FBI. I've been thinking, sweetheart. You've been so overwhelmed lately, and I'm worried about you. Making all these decisions about your father's estate when you're still grieving, it's too much pressure. He paused, and Eleanor could almost see him arranging his expression into tender worry. I think we should get you some help. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the phone. Marcus had warned her this was coming, but hearing it still sent ice through her veins. What kind of help? I've been talking to Dr. Bernard Chen. He's a psychiatrist who specializes in grief counseling and, well, helping people regain their decision-making capacity during traumatic periods. Richard's tone was so gentle it made Eleanor's skin crawl. He's agreed to do an evaluation. Just to make sure you're okay, that you're thinking clearly about all these financial matters. Dr. Bernard Chen, Victoria's cousin, according to the FBI's intelligence. A psychiatrist who'd made a career of declaring wealthy women mentally incompetent so their husbands could assume power of attorney. Eleanor had seen his name in the files on 2 of Victoria's previous victims. I don't need a psychiatrist, Richard. I'm just sad. That's normal when your father dies. Eleanor kept her voice small, uncertain, even as rage built behind her carefully constructed facade. Of course it's normal to be sad. But, sweetheart, you've been so confused lately. Forgetting conversations, struggling to understand simple financial documents. I'm worried this is more than just grief. Richard's voice dropped lower, more intimate. I love you too much to watch you make decisions you'll regret when you're not in your right mind. This evaluation is for your own protection. Protection. The word Richard used for control, for theft, for systematically stripping away her autonomy until she had nothing left. Eleanor thought about Catherine Brennan, probably hearing similar words before she jumped. About Diane Morrison, who tried to fight back and been labeled unstable, incompetent, hysterical. When would this evaluation happen? Eleanor asked, making her voice tremble slightly. I've scheduled it for Friday afternoon, here at the house. Dr. Chin will come to us, so you don't have to worry about going anywhere. Richard sounded pleased, probably thinking he'd won another small battle. And I've invited a few people who care about you. Victoria from my office, my attorney friend Jonathan Marks, maybe your cousin Beth. Just a small gathering of people who want to support you through this difficult time.
En intervention.
Richard was staging a formal intervention with his co-conspirators and one token family member who barely knew Eleanor, all designed to make her look unstable and overwhelmed. The attorney would have documents ready. Dr. Chin would deliver his predetermined diagnosis. And Eleanor would be pressured to sign away her power of attorney while surrounded by people telling her it was for her own good. It was elegant, really. Diabolical and elegant. I don't know, Richard. That sounds so formal. So scary. Eleanor let tears creep into her voice. What if Dr. Chin thinks there's something really wrong with me? Then we'll get you the help you need, baby. There's no shame in needing support during a difficult time. Richard's tone was pure manipulation wrapped in velvet. But I'm sure everything will be fine. This is just a precaution, a way to make sure you're protected as we navigate your father's estate. You trust me, don't you? The question hung in the air like a noose. Eleanor thought about the wire recording every word, about Agent Martinez and her team listening to this conversation in real time, about the trap that was closing around Richard even as he thought he was the one setting it. Of course I trust you, Eleanor lied, and the words came easier now than they had a week ago. She was learning Richard's language, the grammar of deception. You're my husband. You only want what's best for me.
Exactly.
And what's best is making sure you're well enough to handle all these complicated decisions. Your father left you an enormous responsibility, Eleanor. We need to make sure you're capable of managing it. Another pause, perfectly timed. Or, if you're not, that there are proper safeguards in place. Safeguards. He meant power of attorney, control of her inheritance, access to the $22 million he thought he could steal if he could just get her declared incompetent. Okay, Eleanor whispered. If you think it's necessary.
I do, sweetheart.
I really do. And Eleanor, don't mention this to Marcus Wellington or any of your father's other attorneys. This is a medical matter, not a legal one. It's important we keep it private, just between us and the people who genuinely care about your well-being. Of course, he didn't want Marcus involved. Marcus would tear apart this scheme in minutes, would have real psychiatric experts evaluate Eleanor and expose Richard's fraud before it could begin. This only worked if Eleanor was isolated, confused, surrounded by Richard's carefully chosen allies. I won't tell anyone, Eleanor promised, already planning to forward the recording to Marcus and Agent Martinez within minutes of hanging up. After Richard ended the call with another performance of loving concern, Eleanor sat in the silence of her father's study and let herself feel the full weight of what was coming. Friday afternoon. 3 days away. Richard would gather his conspirators, his fake psychiatrist, his forged documents. He would surround her with people telling her she was incompetent, that she needed help, that signing over control was the only rational choice. He had no idea that Eleanor had already been evaluated by a real psychiatrist, one Marcus had arranged, who declared her completely sound of mind. He had no idea the FBI would be listening to every word through the wire she'd be wearing. He had no idea that his attorney friend Jonathan Marks was about to have the worst day of his professional life. Eleanor pulled out her phone and texted Marcus a single word: Friday. His response came immediately: "We'll be ready." She thought about calling Agent Martinez, but the FBI was already listening. They'd heard every word of Richard's manipulation, every careful phrase designed to make Eleanor doubt her own sanity. It was all evidence now, all part of the case that would send Richard and Victoria to federal prison. 3 more days of performance. 3 more days of pretending to be the fragile, confused widow Richard needed her to be. 3 more days of sleeping beside a man who was planning to have her declared mentally incompetent so he could steal everything her father had built. Eleanor walked to the window and looked out at Manhattan stretching before her, 15 buildings standing like silent witnesses to her father's legacy. Henry Hart had built an empire brick by brick, deal by deal, year by year. And he protected that empire with the same methodical precision, building legal walls that Richard's schemes couldn't breach. Friday would be Richard's final move, the culmination of months of manipulation and planning. He would expect Eleanor to crumble under the pressure, to sign whatever documents he placed in front of her, to surrender her inheritance and her autonomy because she'd been made to believe she had no other choice. Instead, Friday would be the day Richard Hale learned that he'd been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. Eleanor touched her father's photograph on the desk, his familiar smile looking back at her. 3 more days, Dad, she whispered. Then I finish what you started. Outside, the sun was setting over the city her father had conquered and gifted to her. Inside, Eleanor began planning exactly what she would wear on Friday. After all, if this was going to be Richard's intervention, she should look the part of the grieving widow one final time. The performance was almost over. Thursday night arrived wrapped in the kind of spring rain that made Manhattan's lights blur into watercolor smears against the darkness. Eleanor stood at the bedroom window watching the city below, aware of Richard moving behind her, preparing for bed with the same rituals he'd performed every night of their marriage. Tomorrow, those rituals would end forever. "You're quiet tonight," Richard said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. His reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, the perfect picture of a devoted husband. Nervous about tomorrow? Eleanor let herself lean back against him, this man who had held her through her father's death while planning to steal everything Henry Hart had left behind. A little. I've never had a psychiatric evaluation before. There's nothing to worry about. Dr. Chun is very kind. He just wants to make sure you're okay. Richard's hands moved in soothing circles on her arms, and Eleanor focused on her reflection in the window, using it as armor against the revulsion that threatened to break her composure. And everyone who'll be there tomorrow loves you. We all just want what's best for you. Eleanor thought about the wire she'd be wearing tomorrow, hidden beneath her clothes. About Agent Martinez and her team, already positioning surveillance in the townhouse under the guise of routine security upgrades Richard had been too distracted to question. About Marcus and the real psychiatrist who'd evaluated her, ready to testify to her complete competence. About the federal agents who would be listening to every word of Richard's intervention turned arrest. What if Dr. Chin says I'm not capable of handling Dad's estate? Eleanor made her voice small and frightened, the voice of a woman who believed she needed saving. Richard turned her to face him, his expression tender and calculating in equal measure. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage is, Eleanor. Supporting each other when things get difficult. His hands cupped her face with practiced gentleness. I'll always take care of you. You know that, don't you? The lie was so smooth it was almost beautiful. Eleanor wondered if Richard even recognized it as a lie anymore, or if he'd performed devoted husband so many times that he'd convinced himself the role was real. She thought about Catherine Brennan, who'd probably heard these same words before she jumped. About Diane Morrison, who'd believed them until she'd lost everything. I know, Eleanor whispered, and let Richard kiss her with a tenderness that made her want to scream. Later, lying in bed beside him, Eleanor listened to his breathing even out into sleep. He was relaxed tonight, confident in a way he hadn't been since her father's funeral. Tomorrow he would finally get what he'd been working toward for 3 years. Tomorrow he would have her declared incompetent, gain control of her inheritance, and begin the systematic theft that would end with Eleanor destroyed and Richard $22 million richer. Or so he believed. Eleanor slipped out of bed quietly, retrieving her phone from the bathroom, where she'd left it charging. Marcus had sent a message an hour ago. Everything is ready. The team will be in position by 9 a.m. Stay strong. Agent Martinez had sent one too. We'll be listening. Remember, you're not alone in this. The moment you feel unsafe, use the safe word, and we come in immediately. The safe word was Catherine. If Eleanor spoke that name, federal agents would storm the townhouse within seconds. It was a small comfort, but Eleanor didn't think she'd need it. Richard had never been physically violent with his previous victims. He destroyed women with paperwork and manipulation, with legal maneuvers and psychological warfare. Tomorrow would be no different, except this time the warfare would turn against him. Eleanor looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, this woman who'd learned to lie with her whole body, to perform weakness while gathering evidence of her husband's crimes. She barely recognized herself anymore. The naive wife who believed in Richard's love was gone, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. Someone who could sleep beside a predator and wake up ready to destroy him. She thought about her father's letter, still carefully preserved in the briefcase that started everything. Outmaneuver him, Eleanor. You're smarter than he ever gave you credit for. Henry Hart had known exactly what his daughter was capable of, even when Eleanor herself hadn't known. He'd given her the tools and trusted her to use them. Tomorrow, she would prove that trust wasn't misplaced. Eleanor returned to bed, sliding carefully beneath the covers, so as not to wake Richard. He stirred slightly, reaching for her even in sleep, and Eleanor let him pull her close one final time. Tomorrow he would wake up for the last morning in this bed, in this house, in this life he'd built on lies and stolen fortunes. Tomorrow he would learn that Eleanor Hale was not Catherine Brennan, broken by betrayal. She was not Diane Morrison, destroyed and discarded. She was Henry Hart's daughter, and she'd spent the last 2 weeks building a fortress around herself while Richard thought she was falling apart. Eleanor closed her eyes and counted through the plan one more time. The wire concealed in her clothing. The real psychiatric evaluation in Marcus's briefcase. The FBI agents positioned throughout the house. The arrest warrants already signed and waiting. Every piece in place for the trap that would close around Richard the moment he thought he'd won. She thought about what she would wear tomorrow. The black dress she'd worn to her father's funeral seemed appropriate. Elegant and understated, the kind of thing a grieving widow would choose. Richard would probably take it as a sign of her fragility, her continued mourning making her vulnerable to his manipulation. He would be wrong. Eleanor let herself imagine the moment when Richard's face would change, when he would realize that every word of his intervention was being recorded, that every person he'd trusted was about to betray him the way he'd betrayed her. The moment when he would understand that naive, trusting Eleanor had never existed, that she'd been performing for weeks while he walked deeper into a trap of his own making. The thought should have brought her satisfaction, but instead Eleanor felt something closer to exhaustion. The The cost of this deception had been higher than she'd anticipated. Living with a man she despised, letting him touch her, pretending to love him while gathering evidence of his crimes, it had carved pieces out of her soul that might never grow back. But it had been necessary. Catherine deserved justice. Diane deserved restitution. The 7 other women Richard and Victoria had destroyed deserved to know their predators would face consequences. And the women who would have come after Eleanor, the ones who would have been Richard's future victims, deserved protection. Tomorrow, Eleanor would give them all what they deserved. Richard's breathing was deep and steady beside her, the sleep of a man who believed tomorrow belonged to him. Eleanor stared at the ceiling and waited for dawn, counting the hours until her performance would finally end. 6 hours until the intervention. 6 hours until the arrest. 6 hours until Richard Hale learned that he'd underestimated his victim for the very last time. Eleanor's hand found her father's ring on the nightstand, the one Marcus had given her from the estate. She slipped it onto her finger in the darkness, feeling its weight settle like a promise. Tomorrow, she would finish what Henry Hart had started. Tomorrow, she would be free. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the city clean. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself imagine the moment when she would walk out of this house for the last time, leaving Richard and his schemes in ruins behind her. Just 6 more hours. Then the performance would be over, and Eleanor Hale could finally stop pretending to be anything other than exactly who she was, her father's daughter, powerful and unbreakable. The last night passed slowly, each minute waited with anticipation. And Eleanor waited, patient as a spider in a web, for morning to come. The living room had been staged like a theater set. Richard had arranged the furniture in a careful semicircle, all chairs facing the sofa where Eleanor sat in her black funeral dress, the wire hidden beneath the silk pressing against her skin like a secret heartbeat. Dr. Bernard Chen occupied the chair directly across from her, clipboard in hand, his expression professionally concerned. Victoria Chen sat to his left, playing the role of worried friend with practiced ease. Jonathan Marks, Richard's attorney, had positioned himself near the door, briefcase undoubtedly full of forged documents. Eleanor's cousin Beth sat uncomfortably on the edge of her seat, the only genuine person in a room full of actors. "Eleanor, we're all here because we care about you." Richard stood behind the sofa, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "We've noticed you've been struggling since your father's death, and we want to make sure you get the help you need." Dr. Chen leaned forward, his tone gentle and practiced. "Mrs. Hale, I understand you've been having difficulty managing your father's estate? Feeling confused by financial documents, overwhelmed by decisions." Eleanor let her hands tremble in her lap, the performance she'd been perfecting for 2 weeks. "It's all so complicated. I don't understand half of what the lawyers are telling me." "That's completely natural during grief." Dr. Chen made a note on his clipboard. "Sometimes, when we're processing trauma, our cognitive functions can be temporarily impaired. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it does mean we need to put safeguards in place to protect you from making decisions you might regret later." Safeguards. The word Richard had used on the phone. Eleanor could feel the wire recording every syllable, Agent Martinez and her team listening from the van parked 2 houses down. She thought about the real psychiatric evaluation in Marcus's briefcase, the one that declared her completely competent. The one that would destroy this charade in minutes. "What kind of safeguards?" Eleanor asked, making her voice small and frightened. Jonathan Marks opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Your husband has been exploring options to ensure your well-being during this difficult time. A temporary power of attorney would allow Richard to handle the complex financial matters while you focus on healing." He slid papers across the coffee table, and Eleanor recognized her own forged signature at the bottom of several pages. Richard had been practicing preparing these documents for weeks, maybe months, waiting for exactly this moment when Eleanor would be surrounded by people telling her she wasn't capable, that she needed to surrender control for her own good. "I don't know." Eleanor reached for the papers with shaking hands. My father's lawyer, Marcus Wellington, he said the trust was protected, that it couldn't be changed. Mr. Wellington isn't a specialist in psychiatric guardianship law. Victoria's voice was smooth, reasonable. When someone is deemed temporarily incapable due to grief or trauma, there are legal mechanisms to ensure their assets are properly managed. This is all standard procedure, Eleanor. We're just trying to help. Beth spoke up for the first time, her voice uncertain. Eleanor, maybe you should talk to Marcus about this before signing anything? I don't really understand what's happening here. Richard's hand tightened on Eleanor's shoulder. Beth, I appreciate your concern, but this is a medical matter, not a legal one. Dr. Chun has evaluated Eleanor and determined that she needs support right now. The best thing we can do is let the professionals handle this. Eleanor looked up at her husband, this man who had held her through her father's death while planning this exact moment. You really think I'm not capable of managing Dad's estate? I think you're grieving, sweetheart. And grief makes us vulnerable. Richard's voice was so tender it made Eleanor want to scream. Let me carry this burden for you. Let me protect you the way your father would have wanted. The invocation of her father's name was the final straw. Eleanor felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. She thought about Catherine Brennan, who'd probably heard similar words before she jumped. About Diane Morrison, whose business had been stolen with this same performance of concern. About 7 other women who'd been destroyed by the network sitting in her living room. Eleanor stood slowly, the paper still in her hand. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, sensing victory. Richard's expression was triumphant behind his mask of concern. Dr. Chen's pen was poised to make a final notation. Jonathan Marks had another document ready, probably the actual power of attorney that would give Richard complete control. You're right, Eleanor said quietly. My father would have wanted me protected. Richard smiled, reaching for her. I'm so glad you understand, sweetheart. This is all for your own. That's why he spent the last 8 months of his life having you investigated. Eleanor's voice cut through the room like a knife through silk. That's why he structured his estate in an irrevocable trust you can't touch. That's why he left me evidence of every crime you've committed, Richard. Because he knew exactly what you were. The room went silent. Richard's face strained of color. Victoria half rose from her chair. Jonathan Marks's hand froze on his briefcase. Eleanor, what are you? Richard started, but Eleanor wasn't finished. Catherine Brennan. Diane Morrison. 7 other women that the FBI has identified. Eleanor pulled the wire from beneath her dress, holding it up so everyone could see. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd just sign away $22 million because a fake psychiatrist said I was too grief-stricken to think straight. Dr. Chin stood abruptly. I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm a licensed. You're Victoria's cousin. You've declared 3 other women incompetent so their husbands could steal their inheritances. Eleanor turned to face him fully. The FBI has been listening to every word of this intervention. Every forged signature, every fraudulent evaluation, every word of your conspiracy. The front door opened and Agent Martinez entered with 4 other agents, badges already displayed. Richard Hale, Victoria Chin, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted theft, and violations of the RICO Act. Richard lunged toward Eleanor, but 2 agents intercepted him before he could reach her. You bitch. You've been playing me this whole time? I've been documenting your crimes, Eleanor said calmly. There's a difference. As the agents read Richard his rights, Eleanor watched his face cycle through shock, rage, and finally understanding. He'd been outmaneuvered from the very beginning. Every conversation, every manipulation, every tender moment had been Eleanor gathering evidence while he walked deeper into a trap he'd never seen closing. Victoria was trying to explain to the agents that this was all a misunderstanding, that she was just here as a friend. Jonathan Marks was already asking for his own attorney, trying to distance himself from his co-conspirators. Dr. Chun had gone pale and silent, knowing his license and his freedom were both about to disappear. Marcus Wellington appeared in the doorway, real psychiatric evaluation in hand. For the record, Mrs. Hale was evaluated by Dr. Sarah Kim of Columbia Presbyterian 2 weeks ago and found to be completely competent in all decision-making capacities. This intervention was nothing but an elaborate fraud. Richard was being led toward the door in handcuffs when he turned back to Eleanor one final time. "I loved you. You have to know that. This wasn't just about the money." Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "You married a fortune, Richard. But you underestimated the woman who came with it. My father didn't just leave me money. He left me the truth. And the truth is, you were never smart enough to deserve either of us." Beth had tears streaming down her face, confused and horrified. Eleanor touched her cousin's shoulder gently. "I'm sorry you had to see this, but I needed a witness who wasn't part of Richard's scheme." As the agents led Richard and Victoria out of the townhouse, Eleanor stood in the wreckage of her marriage and felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks.
Peace.
The performance was over. The trap had closed. Justice was finally being served. Agent Martinez approached her with something like respect in her eyes. "That was extremely brave, Mrs. Hale. The recordings from today will put them away for a very long time." Eleanor nodded, watching through the window as Richard was loaded into a federal vehicle. "How long?" "Richard is looking at 15 to 20 years. Victoria probably more, given the extent of her network." Agent Martinez paused. "You did the right thing. Catherine Brennan's family will finally have answers. Diane Morrison will get restitution. And the women who would have been their next victims are safe now." Eleanor thought about her father, about his final gift of protection that had made all of this possible. "When can I leave?" "Whenever you'd like. The house is yours. Everything is yours." Marcus had joined them, his expression proud. "Richard never had any legal claim to your father's estate. You're completely free."
Free.
The word felt strange after weeks of performance and deception. Eleanor looked around the townhouse one final time, at the furniture Richard had chosen, the life they'd built on lies and stolen futures. She would sell this place, she decided. Start over somewhere without ghosts. "I'm ready to go," Eleanor said, picking up her purse where her father's letter still waited. "Take me home, Marcus." As she walked out of the townhouse for the last time, Eleanor didn't look back. The intervention was over, and Eleanor Hale was finally completely free. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of what had once been her father's estate library, now transformed into the headquarters of the Henry Hart Foundation. Eleanor stood at the window overlooking the gardens her father had loved, a cup of coffee warm in her hands, and watched the city wake up below. 8 months had passed since Richard's arrest, but some mornings it still felt like a lifetime ago. The envelope on her desk held the final divorce decree. Eleanor had signed it yesterday, her hand steady, no trembling required this time. The marriage that had been built on lies was officially dissolved. Richard Hale, currently serving 15 years in federal prison, had contested nothing. His guilty plea in exchange for a reduced sentence had come through 2 weeks ago, along with full restitution of the funds he'd stolen from their joint accounts. Victoria Chun had received 20 years. Her entire fraud network had collapsed like a house of cards once the FBI had Eleanor's recordings. 17 women total had been identified as victims, some dating back almost a decade. The scope of the destruction had been staggering, but so had the relief when Eleanor's foundation began helping them rebuild. "Eleanor." Diane Morrison appeared in the doorway, professional now in her role as the foundation's director of victim services. She'd left her 2 jobs in Newark, used Eleanor's initial restitution to pay off Richard's debts, and thrown herself into helping other women escape the trap she'd barely survived. The new client is here. The widow from Boston whose financial advisor has been pressuring her to consolidate her late husband's assets. Eleanor set down her coffee and picked up the file Diane handed her. Another vulnerable woman, another predator circling. But this time, the woman had called the Foundation's hotline before signing anything. This time, there would be a different ending. "Give me 5 minutes, then bring her in." After Diane left, Eleanor allowed herself a moment to think about Catherine Brennan. The Foundation's conference room had been named in her honor, a memorial to the woman who hadn't survived Richard's cruelty. Catherine's daughter had visited last month, now 18 and about to start college on a scholarship the Foundation had established in her mother's name. She'd hugged Eleanor and whispered thank you, and Eleanor had felt her father's presence in that moment, approving. The phone on Eleanor's desk buzzed. Marcus Wellington's name appeared on the screen. She smiled before answering. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the past 8 months, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation. He'd asked her to dinner last week, a real date with no pretense of legal business, and Eleanor had surprised herself by saying yes. "Good morning," Marcus said, warmth evident in his voice. "I heard the decree came through. How are you feeling?" "Free," Eleanor said simply. "Finally, completely free."
Good.
"Because I have news." The civil suit against Richard's assets was finalized yesterday. $2.3 million recovered from his offshore accounts, plus the sale of his business holdings. All of it awarded to his victims. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting the satisfaction of that justice wash over her. Catherine's daughter would receive a portion. Diane had already gotten hers. The other 15 women would finally see some restitution for what had been stolen from them. "Your father would be proud," Marcus said quietly. "You've turned his protective instincts into something that's helping dozens of women." Eleanor looked at the photograph on her desk, her father's familiar smile watching over her new life. "He gave me the blueprint. I just followed his lead." "You did far more than that. Henry gave you the tools, but you chose how to use them. You could have taken your inheritance and disappeared, lived quietly, never thought about Richard's other victims. Instead, you built something that ensures no one else has to face what you faced alone." After they said goodbye with plans for dinner that weekend, Eleanor prepared to meet the new client. But first, she walked to the window one more time, looking out at the 15 buildings scattered across Manhattan that her father had left her. Hart Properties, each one a testament to Henry Hart's vision and hard work. Eleanor had kept them all, managing them with the same precision her father had taught her, using the income to fund the Foundation's work. The woman from Boston would sit in Catherine Brennan's memorial conference room today. She would tell her story of manipulation and pressure, of being made to feel incompetent and overwhelmed. And Eleanor would listen with the understanding that came from lived experience, then deploy the Foundation's resources, lawyers, accountants, private investigators, psychiatric experts, to build a fortress around another vulnerable woman. This was her father's legacy transformed. Not just wealth passed down, but protection multiplied. Not just one daughter saved, but dozens of women given the tools to save themselves. Eleanor's phone chimed with a reminder. The National Domestic Violence Coalition was presenting her with their Advocacy Award next month. She'd be giving a speech about financial abuse, about the sophisticated predators who used love as a weapon and trust as a tool for theft. The speech was already written, but she kept revising it, trying to find the right words to honor Catherine's memory while giving other women hope. Diane appeared at the door again with their new client, a woman in her 50s with grief still fresh in her eyes and fear in the set of her shoulders. Eleanor recognized that fear. She'd seen it in her own mirror 8 months ago. "Mrs. Chun, thank you for coming," Eleanor said, extending her hand.
I'm Eleanor Hale. Please sit down.
"You're safe here." As the woman began to tell her story, the trusted financial advisor who'd appeared at her husband's funeral, the pressure to make quick decisions about complex assets, the feeling that she was being rushed and manipulated but couldn't quite name why, Eleanor took careful notes and felt her father's presence approving every word. This was what Henry Hart had died protecting. Not just money or property, but his daughter's ability to stand strong against predators. And Eleanor had taken that gift and amplified it, turning her personal salvation into a systematic shield for other women. By the time Mrs. Chun left 2 hours later, she had a lawyer, an independent financial advisor, and a private investigator all working to untangle her situation. The pressure she'd been feeling would stop. The advisor who'd been circling would find himself facing scrutiny instead of a vulnerable Mark. Another woman would walk away from potential destruction because Eleanor had chosen to transform her pain into purpose. That evening, Eleanor stood in her new apartment, a penthouse in one of her father's buildings with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The townhouse she'd shared with Richard had been sold, the proceeds donated to the foundation. This space was entirely hers, chosen by her, decorated with her own taste instead of Richard's preferences. Marcus arrived at 7 with flowers and that gentle smile that made Eleanor's carefully rebuilt walls feel less necessary. They talked over dinner about the foundation's work, about the new legal precedents being set in financial abuse cases, about the women who were finally getting justice. But they also talked about other things: books and travel, childhood memories and future dreams. Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely, something that had felt impossible 8 months ago when she'd been performing grief while planning Richard's destruction. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said as they stood at her window later, the city lights spreading below them like stars. "For everything you've built from what should have destroyed you." Eleanor leaned against him, allowing herself this trust, this genuine connection. "My father used to say that pressure either breaks you or makes you into something stronger. I think he was preparing me my whole life for the moment when I'd need to choose which one I'd be. And you chose strength." "I chose to make sure his protection didn't end with me." Eleanor looked out at the Manhattan skyline, at the buildings her father had conquered and gifted to her, at the city she was learning to love again without fear. Richard thought he was marrying a fortune, but what he actually married was a legacy he couldn't begin to understand. Marcus's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Your father knew what you were capable of, even when you didn't." Eleanor smiled, thinking about the briefcase that had started everything, about the letter that had given her permission to be powerful.
He did.
And I'm finally starting to believe he was right. 8 months ago, Eleanor Hale had been a woman trapped in a performance, counting down the days until her husband's arrest. Now she was an advocate, a foundation director, a voice for women who'd been silenced by manipulation and fear. She was her father's daughter, carrying forward his protective instincts and his strategic mind. She was also, finally, herself, free from Richard's lies, free from her own self-doubt, free to build a life that honored her father's legacy while creating her own. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the window, strong, purposeful, unbreakable, and saw not the grief-stricken widow she performed, but the woman her father had always known she would become. The performance was over. The legacy had just begun.